Good morning, everyone.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
Good morning, y'all.
Morning.
What's up?
Good morning.
Good night.
Morning.
So, I guess let's just jump into it. I don't really know how else we'd start. Let's start with so we're talking about the gospel. Which means good news. If you didn't know.
Right.
And so, what do you guys know about the gospel? Like, can I get a rundown from someone?
The gospel is where we are in debt with sin because of the fall of Adam and Eve, and that Christ came down on the cross to die for our sins. And that's the good news, because we don't have to be in debt and go to hell because of what Christ did on the cross. And 3 days after Christ sacrificed his life on the cross, he rose again from the grave, and he conquered death.
Good answer. Yeah, that's actually what most churches, at least nowadays, Protestant evangelical churches, call the good news about Jesus, which is not a bad answer. I think if we're actually going to understand what the good news is, what the good news about Jesus is, you have to know kind of the background, not just like history, but just the context, of just not just the word, but like how it started. So I'm not sure where you guys want to start with this. We could go into a few things. If you want to go into the history of the word, we could, like the word good news. If you want to go into like Jewish context first, we could do that, or Roman context. Whichever one you want to start with.
Let's do the Jewish one first.
Jewish one first?
Yeah, the Jewish one.
Okay. Basically, the good news comes out of the idea, comes out of the culture of Israel after they have been, enslaved by Babylon. And that would be 586 BC, when they are taken to Babylon because of their failure to their covenant God. And Jerusalem is ravaged, Israel's ravaged, it's all gone, and everyone's banished, and they're enslaved to Babylon. A good thing to look out for is every time the Bible mentions something like, Israel going to Babylon, the Bible usually always mentions the same thing. So can you think of any other time Babylon's mentioned besides enslaving Israel?
Isn't Babylon, was it the place where a bunch of languages are mixed up?
Yes. That's the Tower of Babel. That's also the same thing. And in that case, instead of it just being Israel being enslaved, it's actually it's all of humans going to this one place, Babylon. And it's the same idea. It's, humans falling away, just like how Israel fell away from their God. And they're being banished to Babylon, except the humans in Genesis, which is Genesis 11, if you didn't know. So if the Bible mentions the first thing that Babylon is something that humans construct, and then later on we see that Israel is enslaved to Babylon, what does that seem to mean?
It's the outward picture is recognizing or displaying how broken the world actually is. Babylon and Israel is just one of the big picture, or the big example of how representing the whole humanity, even God's chosen people, couldn't follow up.
Okay, that's good. Let's talk about Tower of Babel for a second, because we're kind of on that. What happens to Tower of Babel?
The people tried to build a way up to God and tried to be supreme, but then God destroys them, and he mixes up their languages.
I was thinking that it was their pride that wanted them to, just the fact that they thought that they could be level with God, the creator of the universe. It was their pride that caused that inevitable failure.
That's good. So you think the cause of Babel is pride?
Yeah.
Is that the same for Babylon?
I mean, well, yeah. I'd say it was like a part of it, just because that's kind of how Babylon viewed itself, as like above all other nations, and it was always trying to conquer and everything.
I was gonna say that. From personally, what I see from Babylon is a place where they conduct a large amount of sin. When I think of Babylon, I think of a place where it runs rampant with sin. It's out of control, and I think pride can be a big one. But I think other things like greed, lust, power, all those other sinful, disgusting things were a big part of Babylon. So I think it was a big part of it, but more or less, it was a lot of sin in general that was overflowing in Babylon.
Yeah, it's like another Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. I like that connection. Why is it another Sodom and Gomorrah?
It was, well, wasn't it? It was about the same thing. It was a city that was run rampant with sin. Babylon's always mentioned of like, it's always mentioned throughout the Bible of, oh, ye Babylon, the great and mighty have fallen and stuff. So.
Yeah, that's a good connection. Like in Revelation, Babylon is described as an icon there. So let's kind of move on from Babylon. So you all know Israel leaves Babylon, 70 years later, just like God said. They return to their homeland, and it's like, oh, nice, Israel's back. But while that is good, the Bible clearly indicates that when they returned, Israel, the land of Israel wasn't the same as what it was before. They weren't connected with God as they were before. Simple example of this is Ezra 3:11-13. It's describing Israel is left Babylon. They're in Israel again. They're rebuilding the temple in these verses, and when it's describing the people's reaction, to the rebuilding of the temple, it says that many of the priests and the Levites and the top heads of the households of Israel, when they saw the temple, they were crying with loud voices, even though many shouted for joy. And the reason for that is because it's not the same. It's not the same. These old people saw what Israel was like, saw what the first temple was like, and they're seeing the second one. God's not in it, right? It's just like this second husk. And so that pattern of like people returning from exile, and it's just a shadow of its former self. Is that anywhere else in the Bible?
Honestly, from my no.
Okay.
I mean, there probably is, but you tell me. I have no idea.
I was gonna say if you could clarify the question, like what you're asking.
So like the pattern, like the idea of a people being in God, being close to God, further sin being banished, and then coming back, and then later in the story, God's chosen people come back, and it's not the same as it was before. Is that
could you say that the journey with Moses, as he went up the mountain, they started creating what's it called? Those golden statues of like cattle and stuff.
The golden calf, yeah.
Yeah.
Like with Abraham.
What about Abraham?
He gets called out by God to go to a place which God would give him. It's like, but like God doesn't walk with him as he did with like the first other humans. So like God promises a land,
Yeah.
I would even go as far to say that similar along the lines of the story of Joseph, how that his relationship with his brothers before he was sold was very poor. Like they hated him. They genuinely hated him. And they sold him. They later in the story they get reunited and their relationship is completely different. It's not the same that it was before. It's changed for the better, but it has still changed.
I think we can also look at, even though this is kind of a stretch, the difference between how Adam and Eve literally walked with God, and then moving on to going into the future of God in the promised land. Even then, it's still not the same because God only inherited the temple, and there was so many different rules and regulations that the priests had to do. Only like the chief priest could enter the holiest of holies. It was not the same, and it would never be the same.
Agreed. That's kind of hitting at the same thing Aaron said. It's actually spot on. Like Adam and Eve, they were walking with God. They were right next to him, right? And then they fall away, just like how Israel did with Babylon. They get outcast to the wilderness, just like Israel goes to Babylon. Then God calls them back. God calls Israel out of Babylon, just like he called Abraham out of Babel. right? Brings them to this new land, but it's not the same. For Abraham, he's not walking with God like Adam and Eve. It's not the same thing. It's not the same intimate relationship, you know? Um, he's not naming the animals like Adam was with God's creation. He's not the same Adam. And then Israel comes back um, to their land, right? But it's not the same. The priests see that God's not in it, you know? They're not in the temple. This pattern, like, you know, constantly repeating, what is this trying to say? You know, not just about the biblical story, but about, you know, overall human nature.
From what I got from that, maybe the fact that we're always bound to fall, no matter, like, we're never going to be able to get to the standard that God wants us to be.
So you think it's more like we're always going to fail? That's kind of the message there?
Yeah. I think that's what I get from it.
I kind of agree with you, but I'd put it like in a different way, kind of.
All right.
I kind of say, like, because of the way humans have, you know, acted, and we personally have acted, humans are destined to live in this unsatisfying state, you know, where they're not what they should be, you know.
Yeah. You're right on point.
Just like how it was for Israel, they come back to God, but it's not the same, you know. It's that kind of pattern. So do you have any thoughts on that? Was that kind of
That basically sums up what I was thinking, yeah.
okay?
And more.
With this whole idea in that, you know, humans are not just destined to fail, kind of a thing. It's less that and more like we're unsatisfied. And I think everyone can kind of feel that, right? Like you can kind of feel your stuff. You fill yourself with things, but you can't really.
We're not satisfied. It's like, another better word is like, in a way, helpless. We're dependent. We need an outside, someone else from the outside to help us from the inside, and that being God. And yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So with that, like you kind of answered it, but like from a biblical standpoint, how does not only Israel and like characters throughout the Bible, but how do like what it's saying humans are unsatisfied? How do we as humans get back to that satisfying state? And the prophet Isaiah and Malachi specifically address that question in their poetry. They write poetry. And so, yeah, I guess we can start looking into that. A little context on Isaiah, which I still can't figure out. Isaiah like lived before Babylon, right? You know, but he wrote about what happens after Babylon. Like not about not prophecy, like stuff that's
what
just
happens after Babylon.
No, like he's writing after, so he's like writing to people who are out of Babylon, you know. So like there's two views on this. There's the view that he literally did, like that was him writing, like as if he like quote unquote prophesied, but even though he's not trying to. Or there's another view where he wrote the first part of Isaiah, and then the second half is his disciples that wrote down.
Is that confirmed?
Yeah, well, those are the two theories, and very godly scholars debate this. So I was just trying to. That's just a little nugget of info. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I have a question about that. Would that change how the what I mean? Because I'm not sure what Isaiah talks about in the Bible, but because there's more than one scholar and for one book, Has that ever happened before? There's more than one scholar for a
So
book?
we don't actually know who wrote what in the Old Testament.
Okay.
There's a lot of ideas, like in what was it? I think it's in Exodus, where they're like, it talks about the city of, it talks about the nation, the tribe of Dan, even though Dan hadn't been chosen yet. The author of like Exodus was like, oh, and they went to this place, which nowadays is the place of Dan. So like they're writing a long time after the Exodus happens.
Right.
So I was just wondering, like, if we don't know who it's written by, then like, because I know that some people that I've talked to before, they're like, well, how can we trust the Bible if we don't even know
Yeah,
who
let's do that.
wrote
Let's talk about that then.
everything?
Yeah. So, I think first I want to address the elephant in the room. Most Christians treat the Bible as some golden tablet that just fell from heaven.
Yeah.
That's not what happened. And it's not like the people who got inspired by the Word of God or by the Spirit of God all of a sudden got like possessed, and then they wake up and they're like, "Ooh, what did I write?" That's not what happened. They were really smart guys, and being inspired by the Holy Spirit, it's like when you're passionate and you're inspired by something, that's what it is. It's the same thing. People can have the same experience today, except they were inspired to write these things, and they're super smart guys. You're about to see what I'm talking about. So this is actually like this is not only a human book. The Bible is a very human book. It's also inspired by God's Spirit, which is God Himself. So it is human, but it's also, inspired by God. So it's not God speaking to you. That's not the point of the Bible. It's not like, hey, Aaron, this is the message I want you to hear. This is people, really smart scholars at this time, writing to an audience, and then we just, by God's grace, we are able to read what happens afterwards. So does everyone understand where we're at right now? Are we all good? Ryan, Aaron, AJ, Sarai, are we good? So I know that's a bit different than what you. That's at least different from when I first heard that. That's different from what I kind of viewed the Bible as. I viewed it as the golden tablet type thing, even though I knew it was written by people. I had that view.
Well, the Bible wasn't saved either.
So like Daniel, there's evidence in Daniel that it was written much later than Daniel. So Daniel probably didn't write this. Scholars probably had a bunch of material that Daniel did write, and then they write it down in this format to make a point. That's the whole point of the Bible, is to make a point. And so that's the point of Isaiah. Nice segue in there. Isaiah in the first half is talking to Israel, who is going into Babylon. The second half is coming out.
Right.
Do we want to explain who Isaiah was?
Well, like from what I can tell, it's like Isaiah was called to his prophet ministry in the year that King Uzzah died, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Around like 740 BC. He lived long enough to record the death of Sennacherib. I don't know how to pronounce that. Sennacherib. I don't know. In like 681. We know that he was the son of Amos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A husband and a father, and that at God's command, he used some rather unusual methods of getting his point across. With the exception of a few details such as these, the Bible focuses exclusively on the prophet's message. God called Isaiah to be a prophet in a time when the people of Judah were no longer faithful to the covenant. The nation's disobedience meant that their prospects for the future involved God's judgment rather than his blessing. Isaiah denounced the people's hypocrisy, greed, and idolatry. The heart of his message, however, is found in the meaning of his name. Yahweh is salvation. Isaiah's version is ultimately a message of hope for sinners through the coming Messiah.
There you go. That's exactly okay. So yeah, because we're trying to look. Our last part was like, we were talking about the human condition. Now it's described. That humans are empty and we can't get back to the place we're supposed to be. We can, but it's not the same. We're unsatisfied. Chapter 448 in Isaiah is he's writing, or whoever is, it's writings to the exiles in Babylon. It's a message of hope. Fundamental message is that God hasn't abandoned them despite them rebelling, but instead of giving them what they deserve, he's going to save them even despite, Israel continuing to rebel and in the future rebelling. The way Isaiah kind of sums this all up is he says that God in Isaiah 48 is going to do a new thing. So far, what God's been trying to do is he's been trying to bring blessing to all the nations through Israel. Despite humans rebelling from Eden, God's master plan, God's response to that rebellion is, I want to bless everyone. I want to bless all the nations. I'm going to do that by having this nation that I'm going to especially bless, which is Israel. When they keep my commandments, I'll bless them, and then I bless all the nations through them. It's a wonderful plan, and Israel's failed. Babylon is the epitome. They're at the bottom of the hole. They completely failed. God's plan seems completely trashed. But Isaiah says God's going to do a new thing here. Isaiah 49 and 50 is what that new thing is. God says specifically he's going to raise up a servant. And what's really interesting, I found this crazy interesting when I was looking into it, he calls him Israel, like as if he's a new Israel, like as if this new servant is fulfilling what Israel couldn't.
Well, I mean, we know that the servant that he's going to be talking about is Jesus, which he does end up doing what nobody can. He is the perfect sacrifice.
That's true. But that's not what I like. That's important, but I wouldn't focus on that. We're trying to focus on what Isaiah's trying to talk about. And he's saying he's going to raise up a servant he's calling him Israel. He's going to do what Israel couldn't do. And what he's going to do is he's going to restore the old Israel to God, despite them rebelling. And this servant is also going to be a light to the nations.
So this servant is for the foretelling of God, right? Foretelling of Jesus. My bad.
Well,
same thing.
You'll see that, but that's not the point. Don't focus strictly on Jesus yet. You want to focus on what Isaiah is saying, and then you'll see it all come together. And what's really cool about this is that him restoring the old Israel and being a light to the nations, it's the same thing Isaiah said in earlier chapters, in chapter 9 to 11. It sounds like the same messianic king described there. After it describes, up to 49, chapter 49 in Isaiah describes what the servant going to do, Israel, what this new Israel is going to do. In chapters 50 to 53, it says how he's going to do this. It describes that this Israel servant, is going to accomplish his goal by suffering and dying, and that he is going to receive disgrace and shame from his very own people. And that's Isaiah 50, 4 through 9.
Really, why?
What do you mean?
It's like going through all that pain for
Yeah.
he's absurd. Yeah. Like he's getting what's Israel doing right now? They're suffering and dying, and they didn't fulfill the law. This servant that's going to be the new Israel is going to do the same thing, and he's getting suffering.
Yeah, wait, what do you mean? Like he's going to be suffering? Is he going to be suffering by the people or by God?
It says he's going to be suffering and dying, and he's going to receive disgrace and shame from his own people.
Oh, then how comes in because you said this was from chapters 50 to 53, right?
50 to 40. This specific part, what I'm talking about, is where he's disgraced and suffering. It's Isaiah 50, 4 through 9.
Okay, all right. Because I'm just looking at 53, and I don't know if it still talks about him, but
yeah, we're not on 53 yet. We're not on 53. That's important. That's coming. But yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
And then we hear later on at the end of 4 through 9, the verses 4 through 9 in Isaiah 50, that's the servant's death. It's being compared to the atoning sacrifice of the Levitical sacrifices.
That's what the Levitical sacrifices were. They were to atone for the sin, but they couldn't fully do it.
Agree and disagree at the same time, but we can get to that later. Does everyone kind of get where we're at? God's describing how...
Somewhat, yeah.
Somewhat? How can I clarify?
I just kind of got lost in it at all, but from what I'm seeing that we're comparing... What do we compare? We're comparing,
okay, so yeah, let me give
telling of Jesus. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
Oh,
fundamentally, that's what's happening here, but don't focus on the Jesus part too much yet.
So what do you want me to focus on?
Okay, so we just went over the human condition, right? Remember that?
Right. Yeah.
Isaiah is writing to Israel primarily, showing the solving of that, right?
Right.
And he's saying it's via a servant who fulfills what Israel couldn't, what humans can't, and then suffering and dying is an atoning sacrifice. Do you get that part?
Yeah, so we're talking about the human condition and how the atonement of Christ can save us from
Yes.
death. Okay.
Christ means anointed one, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a statement. It's not, yeah. So the fulfilling of this anointed one, who is the servant, that's what is being, it's talking about an anointed one who's going to do this. So does everyone kind of get that? Are we good? Are we good on this?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I get that.
Any questions, anything?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now here's the really weird thing. In Isaiah 53, which is the main verse where it talks about him suffering and dying, in 10 through 12, all of a sudden it talks about the servant being alive again for no reason. It's like, and he's dying, he's suffering, he was cursed, all this stuff, and he died. And then all of a sudden it's like, and he was blessed by the Lord, and it talks to him about he will divide booty with the strong because he poured himself out to death. So somehow he's going to be doing an action. He's going to be getting rewards, like being alive and getting rewards because he poured out himself to death.
And this talks about the New Testament or the Old Testament?
This is Isaiah, yeah. This is Old Testament.
That's really cool.
So this is like weird, because it's like at least for like Jewish readers, it's going to be like, okay, he's dead. Okay, they got to keep that in mind. And then all of a sudden it talks about him being alive again. It's like, what just happened there? We're given no context, no description of what's happening. All of a sudden he's just alive and doing stuff.
I would say that maybe in the original manuscript, or the manuscripts that they had in the language, that maybe the way it was written would have given a little bit more context.
Well, you would think that, right? This is not ESV. What I'm talking about here. This is NASB, which is a good translation, by the way. I like that one a lot because it stays true to the actual meaning of the words. So this is actually how it was arranged, just put in more English terms. Not perfectly, but there's no fundamental description of this person coming back from dying. It's just assumed, which I find interesting. Now here we get into the good thing. So that fundamental claim, right? We're understanding the human condition and how to solve it, right? How do we solve our human condition then? Just from using Isaiah, just from what we just went over.
With the atonement of Christ. I feel like it's a really simple way of putting it, but we talked about earlier about how our condition is very severe, where there's no way of us getting out of this alone.
Okay.
And that the only way that we could get out of this is with the atonement of Christ, which is the enlightened one. So
Yeah, we just want to put our trust in someone that can defeat death, and that's kind of how it seemed like it was described. It was someone who would live, and then they would die, but then they're back again. And we'd want to put our trust in someone that can come back from death, because that proves that he has power.
Yeah, but clearly it seems to imply that. It doesn't say that outright, but it seems to definitely imply that this random Israel servant is going to do this. But what's the solving to the human condition? I don't understand where you're getting trust, because trust isn't mentioned here. Isaiah doesn't care what you trust in. Isaiah is saying this is literally going to happen. I don't care what you think. I don't care even if you believe it or not. Isaiah's just putting this out there. So what's the solve? How do you solve this human condition of people being unfulfilled?
Yeah, I would say that we're made out for hell for right now. For right now, we're made out for hell, but because of
hell, where
Christ
you get
and him,
well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the current human condition, not future stuff.
Oh, okay.
Current condition of humans, and so how do you solve that current human condition?
From Isaiah, back to Christ, to that servant who
there you go.
is going to do all these crazy things.
It's this crazy servant, and this is called. Isaiah calls this message of this weird, strange servant called Israel as it uses the word good news. In Isaiah 52:7, he says, how lovely so cool. On the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace and brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation and says to Zion, your God reigns. Okay, so there's something crazy going on here. Isaiah is saying that this is good news in the context of just what we read about the servant, that's good news. But at the end of this verse that we just read, it's saying that your God reigns is the good news. That's good news. Because imagine being a covenant people of God, and then you're banished. And then all of a sudden, you're like, has God abandoned us? Are these Babylon gods stronger than God? The good news that Isaiah is giving is your God still reigns. That's the good news.
That's so cool.
And does everyone get where we're at? Any questions? Any comments? Anything?
It's very nice to hear that. that it talks about this random, just person that may not be so sufficient, and then it kind of like hypes him up, and then we see, after the New Testament that this person is Jesus. I think it's really cool.
So I'm reading I finished this book. It's called 100 Tough Questions About God in the Bible. It's by Stephen M. And on questions number 8, about the suffering servants. From the Jewish view of what Isaiah talks about is it's not Jesus who was the suffering servant, but it's rather Israel. What it says here is the prophecy symbolizes the Jewish people and the unjust servant suffering they experienced during exile in what is now Iraq during the 500 BC.
Yeah, so God right here is not talking about Israel as a nation, because Israel's justly being punished.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He talked about this servant. He named this servant Israel, but called them unjustly being punished. And we know God punished Israel to Babylon because of their uncovenant. So it's someone else named Israel, and that's this servant. It's not that Israel is the servant, it's this servant is Israel. And so we have to figure out who is this Israel guy.
Okay.
So with this in mind, historically and like future-esque for Israel and for us today, regarding the human condition that we all feel, what should we be looking for?
We should be looking for who this servant is, right?
Mm-hmm. So
we should be looking for how we can serve, or like what we can do that would make the servant that solves our problem, what we can do to make that servant help us specifically.
I would push back on that a little bit. God's describing, Isaiah and God are describing us as being enslaved to Babylon. We can't do anything. We're supposed to be waiting. Our whole thing is we're looking for the servant, like Luke said. That's a good way to put it.
Oh, I see.
You look for this good news. You've heard this good news. This is going to solve your human condition, that God still reigns and that his servant's coming. We're looking for that servant.
I would say that we should we need to like also like trust, right?
Yeah.
But we can't do anything.
Well,
we're enslaved.
But can't we trust?
Hold on.
We, like, just have.
I think.
Well, yeah.
I think
Aaron's
right about that, where we can trust that, because I think to wait for something like this, that all we're hearing is either words or someone speaking out of their mouth about this. Having trust in what we're reading and what we're hearing, and something that we can't see, or to have faith in. And I think that's before God came, I think that's what got people saved, was their faith that Jesus, same thing, would come back.
Yeah.
So I think there is some underlying trust and faith in that, for sure.
Okay, so I think Isaiah. Okay, you addressed a whole lot, and I can't address all of it. But about the specifically about this part about the servant, Isaiah doesn't care if you trust or not. He's just saying it's a really good idea because it's good news. You don't have to. He didn't mention anything about trusting. He just mentioned that there's good news, that God still reigns, and there's a servant. I think you should trust it. I would suggest anyone to trust it. Your human condition is trash, and I would trust anything that says that you can be helped from that, especially if it's true. And Isaiah has been proven to be a true prophet because what he said because Isaiah is the one that prophesied that Israel would be going to Babylon, and what happened? They went to Babylon, and God said, whatever prophet prophesies something and it comes true, that's a true prophet. So Isaiah is saying this stuff, right? So it's not only true, but it's really good news. You don't have to trust it. I'm not forcing you to. I'm just saying it's a really good idea to trust this kind of stuff. That's kind of the general outline of the Jewish context. So with all that in mind, whenever you hear someone say, I have the good news, your mind should click back to that conversation we just had. Like, okay, we're enslaved to Babylon. Our human condition is bad, and the human condition is that there's the servant coming. So if someone says, I have the good news, that means they know the servant. So that's kind of the Jewish context. So whenever a Jew is going to hear the good news from now on, every time you hear the good news, you should think of that.
This sounds a lot like the book of Revelations for the New Testament.
It does. It does.
It really does.
Can you elaborate?
So right now, people, we trust in the New Testament as well as the Old Testament from background knowledge. We're waiting for Christ's second coming, right?
Okay. Right.
But then this is sort of similar in pattern as them waiting for Jesus to come. It's like a pattern.
I see
right?
what you're saying. Yeah. I think the advantage for us, though, is that Jesus already kind of came and died. And so there's a little bit, I'd say we would have to have less faith or more faith. I think it's the same amount of faith, regardless if we lived either back then, before Jesus came, and now. And I see your correlation. I just think there's a little bit of an advantage of knowing that, the big, massive prophecy that was being foretold back then has already been answered. And now we're waiting for another new one. And so I think it just kind of, I mean, for me personally, it reassures my faith knowing that, one big prophecy was answered and now another one is coming soon.
Can I actually correct you on that? Because Isaiah prophesied in the same prophecy about Jesus' coming and the government being on his shoulders and all that stuff, and half of it hasn't come true yet because he hasn't had a second coming. So it was more of one big prophecy. It wasn't like two smaller ones.
Well, I'm not saying they're two small ones. I mean, okay, you know what? I see what you're saying. Yeah, I agree with that completely. I just think like hearing, some part of the prophecy being true I think is very reassuring to people who love Christ.
All of it is true, but not all of it has come true yet.
True, yeah, I know. Yeah, it just gives me reassurance.
Yeah.
In some way or another. But I understand what you're saying, and I completely agree with you.
So can I hear all of kind of your end thoughts? I kind of want to hear where we're at before we move on to the Roman stuff.
Ooh, my end thought of these verses is it's more of a reassurance, knowing that there is good news out there, and it just reassures my faith even more. And I think this is a good verse to look at for people who want to study the Bible, especially in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good verse in my opinion.
Sarai, any end thoughts?
It's just kind of been a little bit of an eye opener of all of the connections that have been like all throughout, and
yeah, for sure.
It's kind of gotten me interested in like learning a little bit more so that I can, know more of this stuff, because this is like you said at the beginning, you're going to be surprised as like how much that you really don't know, and having conversations like this and having like deep talks and like actually like going deeper into the meaning of the verse, that's like it's one of the most important things, and it's honestly really cool to see and understand.
Yep.
I like how Isaiah doesn't force people to make a decision, and I feel that like nowadays a lot of people think that Christians are kind of pushy, like this is the one thing they have to do, and you have to do it like right now or else you're gonna die and go to hell. I mean, like this is the one way to get to heaven, but I feel like that stereotype of people like being really pushy, I like how Isaiah doesn't force people to make a decision. He just shows them the facts, and he leaves it up to them and ultimately up to God to decide like if they're going to make that decision or not.
Yeah,
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Isaiah does he does a lot of encouraging, and it's if I were to compare this to like, I don't know, someone like a cult forcing you into a religion, like if someone forced me into a religion, I would draw back. But if someone's encouraging me, there's a lot of, I don't know how to say, credibility, more trustability in God's word.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
It's not a verse that is meant to give you a scare tactic, like a lot of verses do. I mean, it's good things to hear at the same time, but it's nice. It's nice to hear a verse that it's more of encouraging and inspiring, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
You can see how Isaiah or whoever wrote this, whoever was inspired by the Holy Spirit, and it's cool to see how this person writing is inspiring people who are reading it.
Yeah. So I like what you all said. I really like what Ryan said, and Sarai especially, about it's good news. Like,
I want to add a layer onto the good news for a bit.
Okay.
So, what other religion is where like God is serving the people, or God is
technically every single one would have a bit of that. I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
But speaking of other religions, which this is the weird part, the Roman context, which redresses what you're just saying, Kyle, gets into that, and it's really weird what you're going to see. You're not going to believe the type of stuff, the type of parallels that we have in here.
Oh, really? All
Yeah,
right.
let's just jump into it.
All right. Okay, cool.
So now we're getting into what Romans would think. So we just went over what Jews thought. If you said good news, right? If you say good news, you're like, oh, it's the servant guy. It's the new Israel. That's what you think of.
Right.
You hear gospel, that's what you should think of. So when that's what Jews have. But when you say when you tell Roman, good news, we're gonna get into what they would think of when they hear that. A little bit of context for you in the Roman history. Rome, up until this point, up until the time of Jesus, has been marked with constant civil war, political unrest, chaos, people grabbing for power. Last 100 years BC, just complete power grabs, emperors rising and dying, and new emperors taking their place constantly. Kind of in total chaos. That's where we get to this artifact that we have. It's called the calendar inscription of Pyrene, I think it's called. If you're listening to this and you're like in front of a computer or a phone, I would suggest you look this up. So this is a stone artifact in the Berlin Museum, right? It was recovered from the ancient Greek city of Pyrene, hence the name Pyrene.
How do you spell Pyrene?
Priene, Pyrene. I believe that's how you say it. Currently, Pyrene is desolate, and it's located in western Turkey. Currently, this thing dates back to 630 BC. So it's quite old. It uses the word literally. It uses the word gospel in it, but it has that in it, and it refers when it says good news, it's referring to Augustus Caesar. It's talking. This whole tablet's talking about. It's actually pretty short. You could probably read it. It's a few sentences long. It's talking about the birth of Augustus, who is a Roman emperor, and it describes him as being God in human form. It describes, in fact, okay, so up to this point, as I just said, Rome's been in chaos. Apparently, there was this good news going around in Rome that this new king, Augustus Caesar, which has been born, which is God in human form, is going to bring about this new era of peace, finally, for Rome. And everyone's going to be like, oh, everyone was so excited to hear this, right? And in fact, this is the really interesting part. It was so important to the Romans that they actually formed their entire calendar around it. That's why it's called the calendar inscription of Pyrene. You know how like how we have BC and AD and it splits with Christ? You know how that we have that?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing for the Romans, except they used this guy.
So this guy was like their Jesus,
it's
basically.
Except yeah, okay, so I'm going to get into that. But the most interesting part of this is, he's a god king, and he's bringing his kingdom onto earth. That's like the good news, it's calling, the gospel that they have. Now, we know the Romans didn't copy this from the Jews, and we know the Jews didn't copy this good news from the Romans. They sound identical, literally identical. But we know they didn't copy it for a few reasons. First, we know the Romans didn't steal it from the Jews because they hated the Jews. They treated them like slaves, and they're not about to be like, oh, these Jews have a cool story about a suffering king. They're not about to steal that. They don't want to suffer, first of all. They want to be prosperous and powerful and have peace in that way. And they're not about to submit to Jewish authorities for stories, And then we know the Jews didn't steal it from the Romans because when Jews and Christians talk about this good news, they're referring to Isaiah and other prophets, which are way before Rome even existed. So we know they didn't copy each other. But somehow, I would say by the providence of God, these stories came together at the exact same time, saying the exact same thing. The weird part would be, like, because these two stories clash, if someone were at this time period in the middle of Jerusalem, where there are Jews and Romans during the time of Rome, and someone says, there's the good news. First of all, Jews would be like, the servant, and then now Romans would be like, wait, what about Augustus? We already have that. Why do we need, who else, what else are you talking about? It's conflicting messages. So yeah, what do you guys think about that?
I would ask a question from that. Is there a religion nowadays where people are waiting for somebody to come back besides Jesus?
I don't understand how that relates to Augustus.
Well, I mean, I would. The reason why I would say that is because according to like the time we live in now, we could relate that to like we're waiting for Jesus to have a second coming compared to maybe another religion for their quote unquote God or gods to come back.
Well, that's later.
Compare that. Well, I'm saying that you can compare like, oh, we're waiting for the servant to come, or something about Augustus to come. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah. They already had Augustus at this point, so they're like, the good news is here on Earth. When Jews would hear good news, they wouldn't think there's a second coming. Jesus established that later, which I don't want to get into. But they thought, oh, as soon as I hear good news, kingdom's coming, servants here, God reigns. Just like Isaiah said, the good news is God reigns. And just like how the Romans think good news means their God reigns, in human form.
Right.
So like, what do you think about that dynamic? Isn't that weird? How they both say the exact same thing from different cultures, from different religious standpoints. That's just like kind of like a mind boggler, isn't it?
Yeah, it kind of shows how like no matter like what religion people are, we all still have like the same kind of binding principles.
What about you, Kyle and Aaron and Sarai? You too.
Hold on, could you say it correlates to how God's good perfection, how it inflicts on the world? Because like people can use that and like not really understand it in a sense. Because the Bible talks about it like crazy about God's perfect and goodwill, but don't you think people that are confused or create other religions or cults use those ideals to make a good quote unquote religion?
I don't think so. It's not mainly about the religion, which I think you're getting into.
Yeah.
It's mainly about like because these aren't religious messages. This is about a kingdom. This is about a government.
Got you. Okay.
So when Jesus is getting on the scene and when Augustus are getting on the scene, they're not announcing a new religion. They're announcing a new government, a new worldview, a new system, a new humanity. They're not announcing a new religion. If someone comes on the scene with with what we just went over and they say good news, you should think mainly of the Jewish context. Be like, okay, this is a servant guy, right? And then you should also be like, oh, but Romans will think it's against their good news, right? It's a total controversial message every time you hear good news in this context. And remember, if you even oppose the emperor, you die in Rome. So, like, if you come announcing some different thing than Augustus reigns, you're dead. Anything else on that, or should we just move on?
Can you give me more context on Augustus? Like
on Augustus specifically?
Like, was he special? I mean, like, besides being
okay.
Yeah, why did they see him as like the good news?
Like, what was so important about
okay,
him?
so like I said, Rome has been in chaos up to this point, right?
Right.
And so there's never been a real nice government. And so there was this tablet that was written from, like, I think it was a Roman prophet who was like, this guy Augustus, he's emperor now. He is God. He's a god, and he's going to bring peace. And so the Roman people were like, oh,
okay.
Did he do that?
Well, we can check that, right? Look back in history. Nero became king after he died, so he wasn't immortal. Jerusalem starts a rebellion, and then Jerusalem is destroyed, and then Rome is back in civil war.
Wait, there was a civil war back then?
Yes, there was a civil war between the west and the eastern parts of Rome. Because the government got so big that they had to split it because they couldn't handle it, and there was a civil war from that. And Vespasian becomes emperor, and so after him, just more chaos. He didn't bring about what they thought they did. So the only other candidate we have is this Jewish good news. That doesn't mean it's automatically true just because the Roman one was false. So let's look at it. It says that there's going to be this anointed servant who fulfills everything Israel talks about. He doesn't say he's going to bring peace to the whole world like the Roman one did. It said he's going to bring about this new human. It calls them the seed, who are going to be planted and are going to grow into this massive movement, just like Christians were. All of a sudden, the Christian movement spread so far that Roman emperors are terrified of this movement as if it will control their government. And even Roman historians write about it. And that is the most significant part, because Roman historians only write about huge events and like new emperors, like big stuff. It'd be like if American historians only write about like stuff like D-Day and stuff like that, like huge stuff, like presidents and things only. So when they mention some random carpenter in the middle of nowhere, that's huge. A few examples of that would be Tacitus. Tacitus would be a good example. He writes about Christ. I think it's in his second book or his third. Can't quite remember. Anyway, this Jewish gospel happened, and the servant, quote unquote, died, right? And we'll get into that. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on the two gospels we have here, Roman and Jewish?
So it's kind of like a outside source, like something other than the Bible that's kind of showing how what the Bible is saying is actually true. It's kind of like a credible source that's backing up the Bible in some ways.
Yeah.
Like historical documentation of like all of this, more sources than just like one other like accounts and stuff to at least have the solid basis.
Yes. So with all this said, if someone comes on the scene, right, and they say the good news has come, from what we just learned, what are you thinking about?
Well, like what you said, like we should be thinking about, like when somebody says that, we should be thinking about the Jewish perspective. Yeah.
Are you? Sorry to cut you off, but I would say like those two quote unquote gospels become rivals at some point, because it's like one, if you listen to the Jewish one, which should be the correct one in some sort of manner, it would go against what the Roman one is saying. But if you don't choose the Roman one, back then you would be at risk of being killed by the Roman Empire. So I think there is some rivalry when it comes to those two gospels.
Agreed. If say you're back in that time, right? You're back in the time when say you're a Jew, right? And you're in Jerusalem, right, doing your trade, and then you hear some random guy come into Jerusalem, and he's like, "The good news is here." And since you're a Jew, and you go to the temple, what are you gonna think of? The Isaiah servant. That's what you're gonna think of,
right?
And you're gonna think about the good news, which Isaiah said was the good news, which is God's kingdom coming, right? God still reigns. Say you're a Roman and you're on guard in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem at that point was a military zone, and you hear some random guy come into Jerusalem and he says, "The good news is here." What are you thinking?
Augustus is here.
Think of like a new law, because I mean, you said that this guy like put in some sort of like law or commandment to make culture better. Isn't that what the Roman gospel?
Yeah, he said you'd bring about an era of peace,
right,
on Earth.
So you would think of like, a new
you just be like, yeah,
a new
I know.
regiment is being set.
Yeah, you'd be like, yeah, Augustus is bringing peace. I don't know what you're talking about. But what if he starts getting into it and he starts talking about the Jewish good news? You'd be like, you'd be in conflict. You'd be like, what are you talking about?
Because one is off of culture and one is off of religion. So one talks.
Well, they both are religious.
An era that's already.
Yeah, they're both religious, talking about a new government that's going to be set up.
Oh, okay, I know what you're saying. I just think of it more of like, oh, we're kind of saved by the servant, or like the servant's going to come save us for a new era. And I just think of the Roman Empire as like a new set of laws that's going to make living better. That's how I see it.
Okay, yeah. It's not that he was just going to bring living better. While that is a big part, that he's going to make laws. He's going to bring about an era of peace, kind of like heaven on earth, kind of thing.
Oh.
That's what they thought. That's what the Roman gospel is, and that's actually what the Jews thought too. They thought that the servant.
So let me ask this question: did they see Augustus as a god?
They did. That's the whole point. He was God and man.
Okay,
So it's like he's Jesus. One quote unquote Christ, right?
Right.
Is one that's suffering and is not very well known. One is the emperor of the entire world. Which one are you going to believe? You see this predicament? People at the time are going to be like, I don't know. One's more powerful.
Yeah, it's similar to like in Egyptians, the same way as they viewed Pharaoh as like a god more than just man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is anyone confused on anything? Questions,
anymore.
comments?
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, nice. We established the general context of good news, the Roman and Jewish one at the time of when Jesus is born into. Next, in the next podcast, we're going to be talking about what does good news actually mean? Like, what's it defined? We talked about like what it meant historically and what people would think of, but kind of like what did it mean for Jesus, his first followers? How is it used? You know, at the time of Jesus, that kind of thing.
Right.
More up to quote unquote more modern stuff. What we would think of, at least what we should think of. So yeah, see you next time. Do you want to do a new way to end it?
Tune in next time.
See you next time.
Do it
Tune
next
in.
time.
Tune in next time.
All right, 3, 2, 1.
Tune in
Tune in
next
next
time.
Next time.